Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The President Street Boys, Growing Up Mafia, by Frank Dimatteo, narrated by R.C. Bray. I'm gonna go get the papers. Jimmy 2 times. Are yous alone, or are yous by yourself? FBI Mafia wiretap. You can get further with a kind word and a gun than you can with just a kind word. Al Capone. So I read something about the gay mafia in Hollywood. What the hell is that? The kiss of death includes dinner and dancing? Source unknown. You know, that Japanese mafia, that Yakuza, those guys are smart. When they take someone for a ride, they get 45 miles to the gallon. Vincent, Vinny Car Wash, Vivino. 6 feet of earth makes everybody equal. Old mafia proverb. Introduction. A different breed of gangster. It was Brooklyn during the 1960s, and my father was Richard "Ricky" Dimatteo, bodyguard for crime boss Larry Gallo. In one of the ballsiest moves in gangland history, the Gallo brothers, led by Crazy Joe Gallo, became what you might call independents. They didn't answer to any of the 5 families that ran New York back then. They didn't answer to anybody. Larry and his brothers Crazy Joe and Albert Kid Blast Gallo were defiant gangsters who ran their own crew, had their own group of urban outlaws. By defiant, I mean they defied the mob's commission. That's a dangerous practice, but they didn't give a fuck. The Gallos were a different breed of gangster. They had their own style, their own way of operating, and they challenged the status quo of La Cosa Nostra, and that quo wasn't used to being defied. The old-school dons didn't like the way the brothers were doing business. Though they were originally part of the Profaci, later Colombo, mafia family, the Gallo brothers went to war against the Profacis in 1961, and the streets of Brooklyn were littered with dead bodies. Crazy Joe and his crew seemed to have a second set of balls. It didn't take long before the brothers and their small but dangerous crew were waging an all-out war with an established mob that had more men, more money, and more turf. That was the beginning of the end. Joe Gallo and his brothers and his crew ran their operation out of a storefront at the end of President Street near the Brooklyn waterfront, now called Red Hook. When I was a kid, it was known as South Brooklyn until the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway was built and cut it off from the rest of the world. The Gallo crew was among the most feared and ruthless gangs in the history of the American Mafia, and that was the world I was born into. This book tells an insider's story of the President Street crew. Unlike a lot of other mafia books, this one's written by someone who knows what the fuck he's talking about. I was there. It will explore the cause of and the bloody battles of the Gallo-Profaci War, fought for the most part on the streets of Brooklyn. The results were extensive, shaping the other New York crime families to this very day. Here are detailed first-hand accounts of legendary mafia meetings, harrowing crimes, violent confrontations, and inside dope on a mob murder or two that have remained a mystery until now. The President Street Boys, Growing Up Mafia, is a who's who of the American Mafia during the second half of the 20th century. Bosses, capos, street soldiers, as well as shady businessmen, and even some celebrities. The sleazy world of pornography, long before the internet, was also a huge money-maker for the mob. I was a part of that world too, though I never had to take my clothes off or anything. I was reared on the knee of the Mafia, you might say. It's the only life I ever knew. It took me years before I realized that I didn't have a choice. For me, being in the life was the only life I knew. I knew the rules of the street better than I knew my ABCs. I knew that it was a harsh world, and you had to be tough to survive. I also knew, at the time anyway, that those affiliated with the Gallos respected honor, while their asshole mafia enemies did not. I knew all the mobbed-up wise guys, and they all knew me from the time I was born. Thanks in large part to movies like The Godfather and Goodfellas, and later the TV show The Sopranos, the mob guys have been glorified, like they were America's modern-day equivalent to England's Arthurian legends, Robin Hood and his band of merry men. And believe me, Robin Hood and his pals were bigger crooks than we ever were. The Mafia has been portrayed as evil, ruthless killers, heartless criminals loyal to no one and nothing except the almighty dollar. Nothing but a bunch of tax-evading, dope-smoking, coke-sniffing, money-laundering, weenie-wagging, wife-cheating, womanizing, lip-biting, lying, despicable, self-centered, self-serving, horns-waggling, double-dealing, power-hungry, money-grubbing thieves. To me, a young kid from Brooklyn, where everyone in the neighborhood was mobbed up in one way or another, these criminals were also my family members, my neighbors, and my friends. I'm not denying that some of the stuff in those movies is sure as hell true. But like the mob lawyer says in that great old gangster movie, The Asphalt Jungle, crime is merely a left-handed form of human endeavor. Me, I'm actually right-handed, but you get the idea. This is not a history lesson. There are times when I've used published sources, books, newspapers, etc., to better tell a story, to keep things in chronological order, and to give a little outside perspective. But that doesn't mean this is a history lesson. This book is comprised in essence of memories that have history running through them on account of I happened to be where the action was. This is not a tell-all. Some things a guy has to protect. I'll promise this, though. This book contains everything that I've seen. I knew and worked with some of the all-time most notorious and feared gangsters in mobdom, and I became an unwitting witness to some of gangland history's most infamous moments, and for that, I have to thank my father. As is true of a lot of guys, my dad was my idol. His name was Richard, Ricardo on his birth certificate, but everybody in the neighborhood called him Ricky. I wanted to be just like him when I grew up. Who wouldn't? He was good-looking, well-dressed, well-respected, made lots of money, drove fancy cars, and seemed to have the world by the balls. I didn't know back then in my youth that I was only seeing one part of the picture, the part my father wanted me to see. You believe in Santa Claus because your folks tell you the fat fuck is real. In the same way, parents create a mythology around themselves and the rest of the world that ultimately becomes reality for a kid. As adults, we again create false realities, put on those rose-tinted glasses, use denial. People who refuse to face facts have nothing to worry about. They are also notoriously lousy at balancing risk and reward. I was that guy, looking at the world around me as if it were normal, and we all lived together in a glass-half-full world. To me, Ricky and the guys who hung out on President Street were gods in a world full of devils. I believed in the legendary version of the Mafia, the one that kept the people safe and happy, for a price, in a world in which government, law enforcement, and other gangs were all corrupt and needed to be defied. It was okay if sometimes life in my neighborhood seemed to mimic an old Western movie or a shoot-'em-up gangster picture taking place during Prohibition. It was okay because we were the good guys. Colorful nicknames. One thing Hollywood got right about the Mafia is the colorful nicknames. I remember the President Street boys mostly by their nicknames. Little Angelo, Cockeyed Butchie, Ralphie Goodness, Stanley the Hat, Mooney, Smokey, Punchy, and Roy. And in charge were the Gallo brothers, Larry, Albert, a.k.a. Kid Blast, and Joey. When I was a little boy, the Gallos would pinch my cheeks so hard that there'd be tears in my eyes. I tried with all of my might to hide my pain from them, but they kept bearing down until they made me cry a little bit. I thought it was funny, and it was their way of showing affection. Eventually, I learned to tough it out without my eyes watering. When you're around guys like that, you learn early on the value of being tough, so I got over the hard pinches of the cheek. Pain, I was to learn, was a regular part of the business. Dad's start in the life came in 1958, just after he was discharged from the Army. Ricky was a high school graduate from a poor Italian family, and he bounced around for a while, worked maintenance for American Airlines, discovered that he liked to box. It was something that many poverty-stricken kids turned to. At that time, one of the best boxing venues in New York was the Sunnyside Gardens. It wasn't a big place. They tore it down in the late 1970s and put up a Wendy's in its place. But it was famous because during the late 40s and early 50s, it was from there that the old Dumont television network broadcast boxing matches on their weekly show. It was the sort of place where guys on their way up fought guys on their way down, with the newcomers being showcased on TV for bigger shows at Madison Square Garden. Ricky fought in the preliminaries as a middleweight, but he was not a pugilist with top 10 level skills, and he was smart enough to cut his boxing career short while he still had his marbles. After that, he hooked up with Anthony Little Augie Paisano Carfano and Anthony Tony Bender Strollo, who were capo regimes in the Genovese crime family. Garfano and Strollo ran nightclubs in the city, that means Manhattan, and they were looking for a bouncer. Little Augie was the key factor there. He was a man with a history and a lot of enemies. He was a mob killer, killed for Vito Genovese, and unfortunately for Augie, sometimes he also shot people for Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello. 6 times Augie had been arrested for murder, but each time they'd had to cut him loose. Augie was in charge of collecting the Genovese's cut from the New York's garment district. Because of his garment district status, Augie also controlled labor unions there and may have used his muscle to rig a few city elections. He was a Genovese lieutenant, although he and the boss weren't chummy-chummy. Augie's allegiance was in question. In 1959, Vito had called for a meeting of his lieutenants because he was worried about family solidarity. Everybody showed up except Augie. He was discussed in his absence. Little Augie was about 50, but he still enjoyed women as much as ever. He'd had a couple of wives. One was a cop's sister. A dapper dresser, he was known for his white felt fedora with black silk band, his finely tailored suits, and his shiny shoes. Tony Bender was the guy who saw Ricky in one of his Sunnyside garden fights, saw that he was tough as nails, and offered him a job interview. Quizzed and tested, Ricky demonstrated that he was good at handling himself and others, so he was hired. He worked at 2 clubs in Manhattan, the Wagon Wheel and the Gold Key. One night he got into a fight with a black man who'd been spending too much time talking to a white woman, a no-no back then. Ricky floored him twice and threw him out of the club, and only later learned that the guy was Emil Griffith, who in 1958 was just then starting his career as a pro boxer. Griffith went on to win belts as both a welter and middleweight, but he is perhaps most frequently remembered as the boxer who killed a man in the ring on national TV. The fight, against the Cuban fighter Benny Kid Paret, was held at Madison Square Garden on March 24, 1962. At the weigh-in, Paret touched Griffith's buttocks and called him gay, which angered Griffith, and also turned out to be true. Griffith took out his anger in the ring and gave Paret a brutal and fatal beating. But on the night he encountered Ricky Dimatteo in a New York nightclub, he came out second best. It was while working as a bouncer for the Genovese guys that Ricky got to know the Gallo brothers, especially Larry and Joey, who were at the time members of the Profaci family of Brooklyn. They were fans of Garfano and Strollo and came into his clubs all the time. Ricky and Larry hit it off big and became best buddies. On September 25, 1959, Augie was shot in the back of his head while sitting at the wheel of his Cadillac. Augie's last date was with a married beauty queen named Janice Drake. She was married to comedian Alan Drake. The Drakes were swingers. One was just as apt to step out as the other. There was no jealous husband angle. For syndicate guys, a kiss from Janice Drake was like the kiss of death. She made a habit of getting next to hoods just before they were shuffled off the mortal coil. Janice was Albert Anastasia's dinner date the night before his date with Destiny in the Park Sheridan barbershop. More about that later. She was also the date of Garment District power broker Nat Nelson on the night he was ventilated. Augie and Janice went out to dinner that night. After dinner, they drove around in Augie's Cadillac. They were ambushed as they drove down a dark street in the borough of Queens, not far from the airport that was at the time known as LaGuardia Field. The car had continued on after the shooting and crashed into the curb. The hit became famous because a New York Daily News photographer was on the scene immediately. Photos showed Drake, slumped to one side but eyes open, staring at the windshield with a bullet hole in the center of her forehead. Augie had fallen over to his right so that his head now rested in Janice's lap. The hit looked like the start of a war, so Larry Gallo needed a bodyguard. Larry came to the Peppermint Lounge in New York and asked Ricky to come over to Brooklyn with him. Ricky did, and from then on my dad was a fixture on President Street. He got a job in a bar, where he met my mom. As a boy, I would go to the bar to make a few dollars. I'd clean up the place. Plus, I brought my shoeshine box. When the guys came in, they laughed at me. They could see I was setting them up. They liked a kid who knew how to make money, and they'd give huge tips, $10 or more depending. The bigger the gangster, the bigger the tip. I made a good chunk of change. I could bring in $150 on a good Saturday afternoon. Not bad for a kid in the 1960s. This was my world as a kid, safe on a Saturday afternoon. At night there were bullets flying around. The hit on Augie had, as expected, precipitated a war between the Gallo and Profaci contingents. The Gallos had tried to overpower then-boss Joe Profaci and seize control of the family. They had a laundry list of reasons why Profaci had to go, including the fact that he was greedy, imposing unnecessary financial tribute fees from all family members. The coup didn't work, so the Gallos splintered off from Profaci, and a civil war broke out. That meant the boys had to hide out, hit the mattresses on President Street, where they had their clubs and hangouts. They hid in safe places to be secure from attack and be able to plot their own offensives. The phrase, hitting the mattresses, was later made famous in the Godfather movies, where they slept on mattresses on the floor while hiding out. And that part was true. Guys did literally hit the mattresses, because there weren't enough beds at the safe houses on President Street for all the crew that was hiding out. Joey's Pet Lion. Roy had a club there, and that's where a lot of the hiding was done, and so did Armando, a dwarf gangster who worked for Joey Gallo. Along with hosting a safe house, Armando's job was to walk Joey's pet lion. The lion was used as a demonstration tool only, to put the hurry up in those too slow in paying their debts. The lion lent inspiration to a wide variety of enemies and other various victims. The lion never had to attack. Everyone taking down those basement stairs got the idea. See the lion is hungry, pay the vig. The lion was exceptionally motivational, and debts were paid promptly. Some of the crew hid out at Gargiulo's flower shop and Lefty Big Ears' joint. They had the street locked down. President Street was a sanctuary from the bullets of war. It was fairly secure geographically, sealed in at the east by the big trench dug to accommodate the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, and on the west by the water. The street came to a T on both ends. Further protection was offered from the south by the entrance to and the mouth of the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. At the time of the war, Ricky was so new with the Gallo crew that he wasn't widely recognized by the Profaci side. He could move around fairly easily and remained unharmed. For this reason, he was chosen to be one of the shooters on the Carmine the Snake Persico hit. Persico is a big name in the history of La Cosa Nostra, a future godfather of the Profaci family. He was a Red Hook boy, a member of the Garfield Boys who once killed a rival with his bare hands during a rumble. His first claim to fame was being in on the barbershop killing of Albert the Mad Hatter Anastasia, and he was on the list of those who needed to be taken out to defeat the Profaci gang. Persico had been his own entity and an ally for the Gallos for a time, but Profaci offered Persico lucrative rackets in exchange for allegiance. Persico accepted. To demonstrate his allegiance, Persico executed a failed murder attempt on Larry Gallo, and thus ended up on the Gallo hit list. In retaliation for the botched execution, a group of gunmen, including my father, ambushed Persico in the dingy Gowanus section of Brooklyn, where a polluted canal slices through a charred brick cluster of warehouses and factories. A panel truck pulled alongside Persico's car one night, and he was shot in the face, head, and shoulder. Persico lived, and my dad's job as bodyguard was more important than ever, which was easy for him because he and Larry Gallo had a strong and loyal friendship. So there you have a taste. My father's life in the mob, my own life in the mob. 2 generations, 4 decades, an inside story like never before, a first-person eyewitness account of what it's like to grow up in the underworld. Revealed in brutal and inglorious detail, the men behind the headlines in their raw day-to-day business affairs, the seduction, the inner workings. Details based on eyewitness reports and deathbed confessions about some of the Mafia's most notorious murders. It's quite a ride. This book is 58 years in the making. The result is the most personal and accurate testament to the life that you'll ever read. Some myths will be dispelled, others enforced, but the record will be set straight regarding many of the infamous events of mob history. I would like to thank my family, Richard Dimatteo, Amelia Dimatteo, Emily Dimatteo, Christina Dimatteo, Frank Dimatteo, Matthew Dimatteo, Chris Cheramonti, Valerie Dimatteo, Louis and Josephine Floridia, Tony Crispy, my 3 grandkids, Salvatore, Frank III, and Luciano, and Carol Torres. On the pro side, thanks to Michael Benson, author of The Devil at Genesee Junction, and to Gary Goldstein at Kensington Books for their expert support. This book is dedicated to Richard Silver Fox Dimatteo. We all have parents, some good, some bad, some indifferent. I had Ricky and Dee. I was born into a crazy world of blood, guns, scores, and violence. I had no say in the matter. But I learned from what I saw, things most kids don't ever see. Plus, I got to live a life most people are denied. I'm not glorifying the life that Ricky led. It was his life to live the way he wanted to. The family I lived with was comprised of the people I loved, and I have no regrets. I stand proud to have Ricky and Dee as parents. That statement has gone through a process over the years. There were a number of things I had to clarify in my mind before I could declare pride in my parents. I had to come to grips with the fact that the life was a bad life, that those in it miss out on so much, and that it was my life too, and that I, too, had missed out on a lot. Ricky has passed on, may he rest in peace, and so has Bobby Darrow, Punchy, Uncle Joe Shep, and Roy. Now I am left alone with only memories of the life we led, a life I share here in this book with you. Chapter 1. We called it South Brooklyn. To understand why the people in these stories act the way we do, you've got to understand where we came from. South Brooklyn, with a focal point on a protuberance of land jutting into New York Harbor called Red Hook. Red Hook was a part of the town of Brooklyn right from the beginning, in the 1600s, when the place was called Brooklyn on the East River, and King's Highway, still a major thoroughfare wandering through the modern Brooklyn grid circumventing long-forgotten obstacles, was trafficked by the Dutch. 300 years later it was a big city, consolidated in 1898 as a borough of New York City. When they built the Brooklyn Bridge, Brooklyn grew fast, wrapping around the Narrows, through Coney Island, all the way past Sheepshead Bay to Canarsie, which were villages that were swallowed up. It's not hard to figure out how Red Hook, originally Raude Hook, got its name. It sticks out into the upper bay in a hook shape, curling across Buttermilk Channel toward the only yards away western shore of Governor's Island. And there's a redness to the soil, too. Not that there's much visible soil left. In the 19th century, shipping companies built ports called basins. These were the Atlantic, the Erie, and the Brooklyn basins. By the 1900s, there were a lot of piers where hard men could make a living loading up and unloading the ocean-going cargo ships. When the Depression came, there wasn't as much work, and times got tough for a lot of people. People who lived in Red Hook didn't call it that. They called it the Point, explaining that hook in Dutch meant point or corner, not hook. Whatever. In the 1920s and 30s, if you lived on the Point, you were probably poor. The men who worked on the piers were immigrants, sons of immigrants, Italians and Germans and Irish, and they were all called longshoremen. They lived on the Point and worked on the Point. Today, if you go there, you see the Red Hook housing projects. But back in the 1930s, that was the site of a shanty town for homeless guys who lived clustered in a community of shacks, and people called it a Hooverville, named after the U.S. president held responsible for everyone being broke. Today, real estate in many sections of the 5 boroughs is going sky high, so the real estate brokers have assigned trendy names to subdivisions of the old neighborhood. Today there is not just Red Hook, but also Cobble Hill, Carroll Gardens, the Columbia Street waterfront, and on and on. Back then we just called it South Brooklyn. I was born at 113 First Place between Court Street and Smith Street in 1956. I lived there until I was 5. When I looked out my bedroom window, I saw Scotto's funeral parlor, and it was always busy. Same old black hearse every time, pallbearers moving slowly and stiffly, widows behind veils with buckling knees. When I was 5, we moved a couple of blocks up and over to Sackett Street between Smith and Hoyt Streets. Now when I looked out my window, I saw St. Agnes Church, and sure enough, there always seemed to be a coffin going in and out. Even at that young age, I could tell an omen when I saw one. South Brooklyn was a mixed neighborhood, not blended, the ethnicities each having carved out their own chunk. The blacks had the Gowanus projects, the Puerto Ricans stuck close to Smith Street, the Irish were sprinkled about. The Italians had just about everything from Court Street west. There was very little trouble between peoples. For generations, Brooklynites had the Dodgers in common. If you were an Italian and you were talking to a guy who was something else, you could always say, "Hey, how about that Pee Wee Reese?" Or "How about that Carl Furillo?" And you were on the same team. Roy Campanella was everybody's hero. When the Dodgers left, the borough lost some of that, and every once in a while there was racial or ethnic bullshit. Most of the Italian men in the neighborhood worked on the piers. The other advantage the Italians had early on was that we owned all of the stores. My favorite store when I was a kid was Helen's Candy Store at the corner of Sackett and Smith Streets. Helen and her sister ran the place. The trick was to get Helen to smile, a very difficult thing to do. You had to do handstands. She had everything you wanted. That was where I went for my penny candy and baseball cards. Boy, I miss them. Italians also owned the many pork stores, fresh vegetable markets, hero shops, bakeries, pastry shops, restaurants, and bars. On Court Street there was Romeo's Deli, owned by a brother and sister and their spouses. They ran it themselves, always served you with a smile and a warm word, and they treated you like family. Best prosciutto and mozzarella heroes in the history of the world. When the Romeos got old and closed, it was a great loss to the neighborhood. Esposito Pork Store was owned by a friend of our family, Frank Esposito, the father. I bowled with him and hung out with him at the local club, one of the nicest men you'd ever want to meet. He had the best pork sausage and Italian imports in Brooklyn. Going to Esposito's was like attending a museum for great imported food. On display with class and pride were all the Italian formaggi: Asiago, Gorgonzola, Grana Panado, Pecorino Romano. Hanging from the ceiling was prosciutto, capicola, salami, sopressata, and pepperoni. When you walked in, the smell sent you back to Italy, whether you'd ever been there or not, which for some of the older gentlemen could be an emotional experience. It was a smell to make you weep for joy. The sons are there now, keeping it alive. The other big pork store was Aiello's. All of my friends worked there when they were young. If you needed a job, that was the first place you checked, because they always needed someone. It was a huge store and had everything you could possibly need from Italy. And the bakeries, each one better than the next. There was Caputo Bakery on Court Street, had the best Sicilian bread. Camerieri Bakery at the corner of Henry and Sackett Streets, made famous by the movie Moonstruck, had maybe the best bread in all of Brooklyn. They closed the Henry Street Bakery, but reopened in Bensonhurst. Mazzola Bakery has the best lard bread on earth. What can I say? They've been there for 60 years. Court Pastry on Court and DeGraw Streets, where I had my first cannoli and cheesecake, and the best lemon ice. Some bakeries moved and then came back. Montalone Pastry on Court Street changed hands a few times, but they kept the same ingredients because the cookies are to die for, and they serve espresso while you wait. Rainbow Vegetable Market was a small family-owned market at Court and Sackett, run by a father and his sons. They knew everyone by name. If you needed broccoli rabe, they had it. Escarole, they had it. The fruit melted in your mouth, and they would deliver to your house a $2 bag of anything. It's gone now, but not forgotten. At Joe's Superette, they had the best prosciutto balls and rice balls you ever ate. Joe got sick and passed away. Another store lost. Union Street Market at the corner of Union and Smith was a grocery store that was there forever. If you were Italian and lived on the Smith Street side, that was where you went to shop or hang out. I'll never forget the smell of D'Amico's coffee at Court and DeGraw. Frank and Alex were friends of the family. I grew up with their sons. You could smell the Italian coffee brewing in the morning from blocks away. It was a sad day when, with the neighborhood changing, the D'Amicos received a letter from the city. Stop the roasting. People are complaining about the smell. What a kick in the ass. They had to stop because the newbies, full of Wonder Bread and processed cheese food, didn't like it. I would have said fuck you. Sal's Pizza at Court and DeGraw. Fantastic. Johnny is a friend for a lifetime. Johnny today runs the place, trying to keep it the same as it always was, but it's a battle. The pizza is still good. If you want it the old-fashioned way or the new way, makes no difference. You still get to sit with Johnny, have a drink, and reminisce about the neighborhood. You can find me in there once in a while talking John's ear off, complaining about something. The tablecloth restaurants, Helen's, Gloria's, Angelo's, Queen, all on Court Street, all within 6 blocks of each other. All of them gave you good homemade Italian food made by the owners until they couldn't cook no more. I watched them all get old and go. After dinner, you could go to Ebel's Ice Cream Parlor or Mr. and Mrs. Bauer's Ice Cream Parlor, old-school places that opened around 1900 and lasted for more than 75 years until everyone became too cool to go there anymore. As a kid, I remember being sent for ice cream with $1 in my pocket, and I'd come back with a big white cardboard container, like the kind they put take-out Chinese food in now. It felt like there was a bar on every corner. Some of the ones I remember the best are Butch's Inn on Court Street and 3rd Place. I saved Roy's life there once. More about that in Chapter 21. The bar has been gone for years, but if those walls could talk, I wouldn't be here writing. There was the Step Inn for 60 years. My mother worked there in the night.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?